Is everybody seated? I can't even see all the way to the back of the room, which is the measure of some success. Or I'm tired because I've been doing a lot of events, but I am so excited to be here with these amazing smart people that I feel like I have conversations with on the internet about all of this far more often than I get to in person. So this is great. It's like my real life internet. I'm Melissa Gira Grant. I am the author of Playing the Whore, The Work of Sex Work, which, yes, you can get across the hall. I'm a former sex worker, current journalist, and early internet adopter. I think this is the year that marks 20 years that I've been on the internet, and getting into terrible trouble on the internet, and talking about things on the internet that the internet doesn't seem to be built to have those kinds of conversations, which if folks were in the session earlier where Maggie Mayhem talked about very elegantly, the sex workers in some ways are like the canary in the coal mine of the internet. Our speech is often what they come for first, and so if you want a preview of what will happen to everybody else on the internet, this is like a really remarkable opportunity to hear about the way that they come for us, because they're coming for y'all after us. I'm going to quickly introduce everyone, and then we're just going to get into a conversation. And the hashtag for this, you can see it down there. And I also think you're supposed to double hashtag it with hashtag F1. Is that correct? Okay. And then I'm going to do my best to follow along with the conversation on Twitter, and then I'll pose some questions to the folks on the panel. If you absolutely want me to see the question, you should @Melissa Gira. That'll move you to the top of the pile, and I'll take them from there.
What is it, C1?
C1, sorry. So hashtag TTW14, hashtag C1. Or just @Melissa Gira.
Oh, it is F1? Oh, it's cinnamon. All right, we'll go with F1.
Anyway, it's the internet, y'all. We can do this together. It's collaborative. It's happening right before our eyes. To that end, let's introduce our wonderful panel. Closest to me here is Emma Caterine. Emma Caterine is a community organizer at Red Umbrella Project, a peer-led group working to amplify the voices of those in the sex trades. You can find out all about them also in Studio D afterwards and purchase some of their fantastic swag. She's also the host and the producer of Sassy Syndicalist, a weekly video blog looking at political issues like sex workers' rights. Next to Emma, we have Hot Kinkaid. He's the founder and the current president of Hook Online, an advocacy group for men in the sex industry. Kinkaid is a former sex worker, current writer, spoken word artist, and lifelong harm reduction activist. And this is exciting. Recently, he became the first COO for rentboy.com. It's amazing. And next to Hawk is Stoya, an adult film performer and writer. She's also involved with the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee, which advocates for better education and working conditions for adult performers. So let's welcome our panel. And this really is going to be more like a conversation, but I'm going to have to pass the mic back and forth to you all, so feel free to like jump on each other. Don't jump on each other, but like jump for the mic and take it from each other.
Only at the end. It's a happy ending.
For the benefit of our friends on the live stream so that they can hear us, and also everybody in the back of the room. So my first question for everyone, just as a way to reframe this conversation from the start, because I don't really know what everyone is coming into this conversation with in regards to their understanding of sex work. So just to put it out there, sex work, it's work. And something people who study sex work often miss that very simple fact. And often the focus on sex work when we're talking about it, particularly on the internet, it's usually about exploitation or entertainment, something salacious. And the reality of our working lives and our labor is often left out of that conversation. So I'm going to ask you each, one by one, to tell me what's something important to you about your work and to you that's most missing from this popular understanding of what sex work looks like. What's the thing that people just absolutely forget to ask you about when they come at you with questions about sex work?
Start off with the hard question, okay. Again, my name is Emma, and I work with a group called Red Umbrella Project. And in the work that we do, an issue that we come across a lot is getting into contact with people in the sex trades, because folks are understandably not always willing to put themselves out there and talk to other people, even when there's someone like me, about their experiences, about who they are, to meet in person, or to participate in any sort of advocacy. What what I think often gets missed in these discussions is that the ways in which so many groups, regardless of their political lean, get into contact with people in the sex trades is through other people in the sex trades. That we have prior established community networks like everybody does. Like folks who are web developers know, 5 other web developers, or, plumbers have plumbers unions, and we all organize around our labor in different ways, and sex work is no different. So that's something that I think I would like to see get brought up into the conversation more, is that we're not these, whether we're in situations that are coercive or exploited, or whether, we're making hundreds of thousands of dollars and living the good life, we are not these individualized, lonely, solitary beings in the universe. We're parts of communities of people doing the same thing.
I think that's great. I would agree with that. Another thing I would add is oftentimes in media, they don't talk about sex work as emotional labor, which it often tends to be. So a lot of the time that people are spending with their clients, which I will say that escorting makes up a large chunk of the industry, probably a predominant section of the industry, that the time with clients tends to involve communication and contact. 9 times out of 10, it just involves dinner. There were times that I had clients, for example, that you literally just had dinner and that's all you had, and it was just to be able to spend time with somebody who was outside of their life in another way, and they wanted to hear about you and who you were and the time that you spent. And when you think about it, if you take multiple clients over long periods of time, it essentially becomes a care industry, which is actually one of the things that I think draws in a lot of people who choose to work in this industry as careerists, or what we call sort of long-term workers. They're people who begin to take an interest in their clients, the clients take an interest in them, and kind of it's like an emotional vacation for the client, and for the worker it's really a type of care, where they're looking after that person, they're giving them feedback, they're having a really good constructive conversation. And I think that's oftentimes missing from the conversations the media certainly portrays within people who work in the industry.
I'm mostly a performer in videos, so it's much more like the entertainment industry than it is service or care. And what I see surprise about regarding things that are work is a lot of like, oh, you guys pay your taxes. It's like, well, yes. we show up on set and we have to fill out paperwork and 1099s and W whatevers, and I should probably know exactly what paperwork it is I fill out. But there's a lot of record keeping involved, and things are very tracked, and I guess it seems like reporters frequently think we just show up and have sex and have no idea who we worked for, or like what's...
I think there's ways that all of those kind of manifest in the media narrative and also the kind of popular narrative about sex work and the internet, whether we're like all alone by ourselves, like the sex worker equivalent of like the blogger in their pajamas or something, I don't know, like, who doesn't know anybody and is like completely isolated. And that, for the emotional labor side of it, I think of like how much of my work as a sex worker was about email. Like just how much time I spent on email, how much time I spent like crafting the right email to hit the right notes with somebody, like all the emotional management of like getting somebody to actually book an appointment and then keep their appointment, and marketing too online. Like I think we've talked about that a lot, how like that's such a huge part of the work. So the actual like ins and outs of fucking is like really a much more minuscule part of sex work than many people think. But in the video and film entertainment, that's very specifically negotiated on the front end a lot of the time. Like I won't agree to a scene unless I know who I'm working with and what acts I'm expected to perform, down to like, okay, so during the blowjob part, are you gonna want it like really hard and spitty, because I will probably throw up if I try to shove that man's penis all the way down my throat. Like it gets talked about that detailed a lot of the time.
Well, and I wanted to add, I mean, in that, with the emailing back and forth, I mean, a lot of people, I think, underestimate the amount of business sense that a lot of these people who are working in this industry for a long time are using. Everything from investment strategies, I know several that have accountants, and that sort of structure their lives and their business. They're watching their marketing spends. They're really assessing it like a business. And again, I think that's oftentimes understated within the way the business is portrayed.
So one kind of jumping off point to get into the internet more focused side of the conversation, and this might be just me as a journalist, I'm really annoyed by lazy journalism about sex work, because never before has it been easier to not do lazy journalism about sex work. Like, never before has the wall between journalists and their potential sources of sex workers been thinner because of the internet. And yet, at the same time, I feel like just that sex workers use the internet becomes a story all the time. So it's like, did you hear about X new app? Did you know that sex workers were using it? Did you know that sex workers were using Airbnb, right? This was like the front page of the New York Post this week. You know, and it's like, is that news? Is that really news? I'm not sure that's news. I think that you're just not actually paid enough to leave your desk as a reporter, and I'm sorry, I empathize, but like, really get on email and talk to any of these wonderful people. So what I think is actually going on there is this idea that, like, you know, as far as I'm concerned, sex workers are the consummate early adopters of technology, and we often don't get credit for that. And at the same time, online businesses and platforms discriminate widely against sex workers. Some of the examples we've already talked about in this conference: PayPal, Amazon, Facebook, web hosts, even online banking. Chase is pulling bank accounts of porn performers right now. So I want to ask this panel, you know, how have you experienced this kind of exclusion or discrimination in online services? And how have you been censored? And are there any online platforms that actually do right by sex workers and are welcoming of sex workers and don't exceptionalize us being on their platform as some kind of, you know, dirty joke? Who would like to go first?
One thing that we've experienced, Red Umbrella Project has experienced, is we do a lot of media campaigns. And one of our big platforms for doing this is the website Tumblr, which I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with. And as some of y'all may know, Tumblr was recently bought out. And after this buyout, some changes have started to occur in the ways in which Tumblr manages its content. Now there are official blocks on adult material, and while this is something that you can toggle on and off for your particular Tumblr profile, it starts as the default. And then furthermore, most of the mobile apps that I've seen for using Tumblr do not allow you to look at adult content. Now, keep in mind that the vast majority of our content is not in any way pornographic or even describing sexual acts at all. It's talking about things like, hey, there's a free HIV testing going on so-and-so street today. And unfortunately, we're not able to get out this information to sex workers because there are these blocks on it that automatically happen because they just know that we're this organization that deals with this population of people.
There are so many facets to that question. I don't even know exactly where to start. But certainly in my experience working both on the harm reduction side and then on the corporate side now, I can speak first to the harm reduction side, which is where I'm most of my time. We have been moved from varying servers over the years. We've had issues with banking and so on and so forth. And we're specifically a harm reduction advocacy program. So we don't, we're not a listing service. We're not engaged as a corporate entity within the business. We're a 501c3. And we have had to move servers at different times. We've had to make changes depending on the resource because the material is objectionable.
Can you give people an example?
An example would be a hosting agency. So a hosting, like a web hosting company.
Of the material.
Of the material. So we do things, we do interviews with people who work in the sex industry. We do tips on how, for example, watching the clock while you're with a client, tips on how to manage that, or what the value is of reviews for escorts and so on and so forth, or the recent issue like that. And then we also cover things like the meningitis outbreak and things like that. So we cover health things as well, but we also cover a lot of sort of how to engage constructively within the industry. And that stuff it's too threatening for a lot of places. We also do have stuff that is on stuff like bottoming, fisting, other things that we take as a sort of a health approach on. In other words, things that you can do in a healthy way and good choices that you can make there. So that material is considered adult, and we know that. We even put the disclaimers on there. But because the nature involves prostitution or it involves talk about sex work, that becomes too complex, and so we've had to switch agencies. And now I vet any hosting agency, and by hosting I mean web hosting, so where a site sort of lives. I'm sure you guys probably know that, actually. Of all the audiences that I could probably explain that to, you guys are like, yeah, thanks. Hashtag stupid. Okay, so obvious.
Basic.
So basic, hashtag basic. So I have to vet agencies now. So when I look at a web hosting agency, I have to make sure that they have a history and are comfortable with the content before I work with them. So certainly there's that. And then as far as corporate stuff goes, of course, there's also issues there. I mean, all the banks, everyone is familiar with the Chase issues of the last week and a half. Banks do not like the idea that sex work is in any way involved with the incomes that are represented there, yet they take the money from people who are obviously engaging in other criminal activities at any given day. And sex work, by the should know, is not criminal, so that's also important. I want to say, though, that it actually extends offline. Well, actually, two things I would like to add to that. One is that because of the internet and the ubiquitous sort of presence of the internet, that this really has raised a lot of issues for people's employment who have worked within the industry. So because your name can be traced to perhaps engagement within the sex industry, perhaps as far away as 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, as long as the internet was in existence, a company can fire you. And so because HR departments are incredibly thorough, they have used that as part of their strategy to not hire people over long periods of time. So when you talk about discrimination, it's not just about services, but it's also that employers within sort of real world, like people who are moving out of the industry, transitioning to another job, skilled for that position, may even have been hired for that position. I had one case where I had a contract that was killed because I do advocacy for people within the sex industry. They can go and Google and for no other reason just decide to cancel that experience. So that's a big threat for a lot of people who are within the industry, a very tangible one. And then another thing is, because you talked about early adoption, I've always believed the sex industry, probably like the gambling industry, are probably at the forefront of any possibly, what's the word I want to say, experimental, interactive experience that could possibly get in your way. So we have found ways to banner things that never existed before, that every other industry in the world has sort of adopted. So the splash pages, the banner techniques, all that stuff, if it existed, we found it first. Like, I mean, we were at the forefront of it, and I think that's always been the history of certainly the porn industry, as well as casinos. I think casinos too.
I would support that until Blu-ray happened. But then they didn't want to let us use Blu-ray for a minute, so now we're not. I've personally had issues with Chase, which is why I was giggling, because they shut down my business account, but then didn't understand why I wanted to close my personal account. But other than that, I've never personally experienced issues with like Instagram or Twitter or Tumblr or anything like that, because I don't put my butthole on social networking services that children might stumble into. And there is definitely a certain line where adult content that is pornographic isn't supposed to be available to minors. And so there is a certain amount of respect that needs to be shown there from coming from the perspective of my work as a performer. But then when we're talking about educational stuff, that's a completely different story. I think part of the problem needs to be, or part of the way to fix that problem is getting them to realize that there's a difference between entertaining sexual acts versus stuff that needs to be understood and is knowledge and is education.
Yeah, I mean, there's something we were talking about earlier about just the idea of like anything that somebody who is associated with the sex industry does on a website, it's almost like there's the cloud behind them, like not like the cloud, but almost like I'm picturing like Linus or Pigpen or something, and it like follows you. So it's like even you posting your innocent cat photos on Instagram, which everyone should follow. There's always the threat of like, but what if it went off the rails? And that's what I hear you saying. It's like you're posting like educational material, but there's this like scarlet letter around everything that you do on a site. And I feel like that's sort of where that paranoia and that panic comes from. And I think that, what the source of that really is at the end of the day. Hey, come on up. We have a late-breaking panelist, I believe. Hooray! I was saving this as a surprise because I was hoping it was going to work out, and it did. Hi.
We'll blame New Jersey.
Okay, so I am going
We
to...
always do.
Right? So this is Najela Rhee, who you may all know as the co-host of This Week in Blackness After Dark. She's also a journalist and a BBW adult web model and phone sex operator. She's also one of the people behind the hashtag Not Your Rescue Project, which is just, I think, how we met. She is situated at the intersection of nerd culture, identity politics, sexual revolution, and she's an expert at navigating difficult digital spaces. Her blog, Blasian Bitch with a Y, celebrates and explores sexuality from a Black Asian perspective. Thank you for joining us. So we're talking about stigma. That's where I was jumping in. And so what we've just been chatting about is, how there's this sort of like this cloud of stigma that some web services believed like you just couldn't allow sex workers to use that service. I'm thinking of Amazon as an example, right? Where in the last year or so, more and more people who were using Amazon as keeping wish lists on Amazon for their customers as sex workers, not necessarily doing sex work on Amazon because I think that would be quite difficult, but like
eBay.
But saying, hey, customer, if you want to get me a present, here's my Amazon wish list. Just like, hey, grandma, if you want to give me a present, here's my Amazon wish list. And Amazon started, pulling people's wish lists because they were basically profiling them as somebody who might be doing sex work. And so I think what's going on there is stigma. This is anti-sex work stigma, which is, a part of both the education that we do, trying to combat that. The advocacy that we do is trying to combat that. And I think that that's one of the leading factors in all of this discrimination, to try to create these divides that are impossible to create, like between the internet with the sex work on it and the internet with sex on it, and then like the rest of the internet, which PS is full of sex. Like, you can't do this. You can't create, it's the internet. There's always more internet. You can't just say like, Craigslist tried to do, we're not gonna let sex ads be here, and then Backpage is like, holla, and they go over to Backpage. And then if Backpage got shut down, like, where would they go after that? So this is impossible, and we know this is impossible because this is where we live and we are experts, and they don't tend to ask us when they come up with these policies to try to segregate the internet. But from there, I want to kind of talk about a different kind of divide, which is the power differences, I think, even in our own communities. This is like kind of a place to talk about the digital divide and sex work and some of the things that happened around Not Your Rescue Project, like when people were trying to be critical of it, saying, but there can't really be sex workers on Twitter, right? Like on a hashtag, like those must be like some really privileged sex workers with telephones. I can't imagine, which like you need a telephone to do, I think basically. Like I know people who, live in single Vermont, who even see hotels and primarily solicit clients on the street who still have mobile phones because this is absolutely essential. So, there's all these kinds of myths about privilege and technology, I think, operating there. So I wanted to ask you guys about that. We have real divides, even in our own communities, between sex workers who primarily do work online, whether it's like webcam performance or porn, different kinds of porn online, or escorts who use the web to advertise, versus people who primarily meet people in person, in offline spaces. And there's also really pragmatic and important differences between how we present ourselves online as sex workers and the persona that we inhabit when we do that, and the way that we talk about ourselves, and the kinds of websites we create, and the content we create around that, versus how we might present ourselves to each other in community and doing advocacy, and like the multiple roles that people kind of juggle there. So I want to know about those kinds of divides. Like, how do you bridge those divides between different communities in the work that you do, and how have you experienced those kinds of differences and divides in your work? Who would like to, do you want to jump in since you just got here? Take all your time.
I'm very happy that you mentioned Not Your Rescue Project, because it was something that, funny enough, it started because Suey Park and I were complaining about freelance work and trying to get paid, and I was complaining, it's like, well, you know, I'm very out as a sex worker. I don't hide that I do it. I'm not ashamed that I do it. And I really felt that I wasn't gonna get the type of work, or when I pitch projects, people would go, oh, that's nice, but can you talk about the sex some more? And from that, we started talking about representing ourselves as feminists and why people might have problems with that. And it was just, it kind of snowballed with different sex workers who we both talked to on Twitter, all exchanging, you know, grievances they had about people speaking for us, like we can't speak for ourselves. And early on, I was actually a little afraid because we are an at-risk group, no matter how elite, if you want to call it, a sex worker you are, no matter how privileged you are, we're still an at-risk group simply for being open about being sex workers. And that it happened to one of the people that was very instrumental in getting the hashtag out there, and still it's doing a lot of work using the hashtag, got raided because she got into an argument with somebody and they claimed that she was being trafficked. And
so someone reported her to the police.
Yeah, and she had her home raided, her cash taken. They took her tablet, her cell phone, and her computer to check for trafficking, how they're supposed to do that. So the idea that if you're using technology and you're a sex worker, that there must be some trafficking involved, or we can't really be speaking for ourselves. I got to a very weird argument with a woman who basically said, well, you're here on Twitter, so you have the internet, so you're super privileged. So either you're super privileged or you're just a pimp trying to make sex trafficking look attractive.
Because that's what pimps do on Twitter all the time.
Yeah, that's apparently pimps love Twitter. Wow. So it's aggravating to try to speak about how sex workers use the internet or different technologies, because we're people. And what annoys me is people will write stories like, oh my God, sex workers are using Square, or sex workers are using
literally said that before you
Airbnb.
got here.
Yes.
Yeah. No, keep going, keep going.
And it's like, well, of course we use it because we're people. So I use Uber. I don't use it to sex work. I just use it to get here. But people make this big to-do about it, especially in the media, which is this kind of othering of us, like we're not whole human beings. And I really think that feeds into the stigma that our very existence, there's something taboo about us being in any space. I've been kicked off of websites simply because I don't use Blation Bitch when I sign up for things. I usually just use Rhee. And if you Google me, my stream mate profile is gonna pop up, or iFriends or whatever else I've done, or Right Flirt. And I've been kicked off of sites. Like I wanted to brush up on Korean, so I joined the language exchange. And I got a letter like, I'm very sorry, but you are violating our terms of service. I was like, but I didn't fill out my profile yet. And they basically just saw the email that I used and connected that with sex work, so I just couldn't exist on the site. And I think that's a huge problem, and I think the big thing that we're going to have to fight is recognizing that this is discrimination, and we're legitimately being pigeonholed for the work we choose to do.
So we've been talking a lot about how these various different, from banks to social media to Amazon, whatever Amazon is, discriminate against people who trade in sex. And the question of the digital divide is always one that's in my mind, because in the work that I do, I'm working with a different group of folks then we often get to see on panels like this, working with people living on the streets, people who are trans women of color, people who are doing sex work, not because they feel some calling to it or because they're interested in doing it, but rather because it's the only form of employment they can access. For them, this discrimination hits even harder because of the digital divide, where if you think, dealing with all these annoying things on the internet is bad, try dealing with it on a computer in the library. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever used a computer in the library in New York City, but it's awful. And we had one member particularly who did have an iPhone. She didn't tell me how she got it, so who knows? But it didn't have service. She just used wireless, so she would have to go into cafes or stuff like that, and she would get kicked out occasionally because of whatever sort of rules they had in this cafe, and it was basically like this continual tax. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with this idea that a few articles I've been writing about recently, but about how being poor is more expensive than being wealthy. Well, it's the same sort of thing with the digital divide in sex work, where for people doing sex work, it's more expensive to do sex work when you're on the lower end of the scale, because you're more regularly interacting with police, and to get internet access costs more in the long run, even if you're paying less in the short term.
I just wanted to say something.
Just quick about the police, because we haven't really talked about them enough yet. And they're awesome at social media, right? Oh my God, hashtag MyNYPD. We could do a whole panel. Yeah, I love that they're finally catching up to us. It's wonderful. So, and literally catching up to us. Like, this is the thing of like, any of these opportunities for sex workers to adopt technology also becomes an opportunity for police surveillance. And that's something that I think of when we think about digital divide issues too, is like, part of the reason that sex work online has exploded so much isn't just because of the internet, but because the police are so policing people who work in the street and in public facing places, that the internet is a safe alternative to that. But at the same time, the people who are getting most policed have the least access to the safety that the internet could provide them. So it's a very tense kind of breakdown right now as the industry's changing.
But again, in porn, use of social media and saying, I'm shooting right now at this place, click, that's pretty much an invitation for Vice or the permit police or just anyone who the government might want to send to stop by to then knock on the door and come and check that everybody has 2 forms of ID and everybody wants to be here, right? And all sorts of things. So it's use of social media in porn can be what brings the police down on you.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point. Actually, to address that, on our side, certainly there has been talk about Grindr and Scruff while we're here, and so on and so forth. And there's been talk about adapting that for people within the sex industry. And nothing would scare me more than the idea of saying, "Hey, I'm an escort, and I can be found at the corner of 14th and 5th right now. Sign me up." I'm like, maybe not. Maybe that's not such a good idea. So we certainly also have to be very critical about the way we approach technology and what we're going to adopt, because we also have to think about our own security in that regard in terms of what we're adopting. Digital divide is interesting because, again, I think Emma sort of summarized, I think, really a lot of the discussions that we've had, certainly in how we approach men in the sex industry, because the street population is a very different population. You're talking about people who are affected by so many factors that, to me, are far more paramount than the sex work that they're engaging in. So we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about drug use, we're talking about LGBT youth who are sort of thrown out of their homes, we're talking about trans workers who can't find other forms of employment, we're talking about trans workers of color who are ostracized in many different ways. So I think there's a very different population from that, and again, those who can access the digital world and create a digital identity and sort of build on that and build an entrepreneurship within that business. So that's certainly sort of sometimes I think a little bit, I agree with that very much. The digital divide between who you are and the sort of performer that you are, I think, is interesting, because that's one that we've talked about a lot, especially because you are selling a particular personality. You are selling kind of a different person than the person that's out there. I'm seeing less of that now. I mean, what's interesting about some of it is that where there used to be sort of the overt sort of porn star, you know, like, hey, yeah, you can take it hard. And then you get them off shoot and they'd be like, excuse me, I'm sorry. Was that too loud? And you're like, yes. And, you know, we're seeing less of that. We're actually seeing within the social media, we're seeing more of an illusion of the identities as a whole, that people, as they're engaging in the industry and they're sort of embracing the industry, they are kind of being themselves a little bit more. In fact, among escorting, that's always been the case for the most part, where people are selling that emotional labor for men. There's always been emotional labor. There's a little bit of performativity there. There is among men of color. There is among certain identities like kink and so on and so forth. There's this sort of performativity. But there is also sort of an ongoing dialogue about how natural can I be, how much of this is my personality, and that's starting to translate a little bit more, where the people in the sex industry, there's starting to be less of a, at least through social media, less of a divide between the person that they are outside and the person that they are when they work. And I think that's really interesting, because I think that poses some different vulnerabilities, as well as it maybe even sort of humanizes an industry that so far has been presented as a very inhuman kind of experience. So you want to say something?
Oh yeah, you jump in. And I want you to talk about that too.
I think it's a great point that you bring out, the persona versus the person, because I do podcasting, and I was doing sex work way before it. I went from being an exotic dancer at like BBW nights at like Hunts Point. Wouldn't recommend it. And going on to doing cam performance just because I was like, I don't like being punched in the face. So I felt being online, I had more like wiggle room to be myself, but also like because I have a following on my podcast and on my Twitter and these types of things, I'll get a call and like a phone sex call, and I don't usually talk like this because I think I kind of sound like a chipmunk. So I put on like the phone sex voice, and they'll be like, Najela, like, what are you doing?
Can we hear it? Can we hear it?
Hi, you're connected to Night Flirt. This is Najela.
Yes! Everyone, when they ask their question, has to do a phone sex voice.
So I am kind of happy now, because I'm also a huge friggin' nerd, so I love the fact that I'll have a call that'll start off with phone sex, and they'll be like, by the way, did you see that new trailer for Dragon Age Inquisition? I'll be like, oh my god, yes! And I can make money talking about video games. So I do think it's great that we have that, at least that space where we can be ourselves and show ourselves as being human. But I think another aspect of the digital divide is there's kind of, I don't want to call them leeches, but people that kind of like hang around in the outskirts of the sex work community, and they're kind of basically marketing their services to say, oh, I'll make you a online presence, or I'm gonna code your site, or I'm gonna do this and that for you, and they jack up the price exponentially because it's dealing with sex work. So it kind of becomes like the sex worker tax, because these performers might not have as much access as these people that are kind of hovering around because they could dip in and out because it's not their face on the website. So I think that I'm happy that that's happening less and less, and I'm seeing a lot more performers that are very happy that like, oh, I coded my own site, or I installed the webcam on my own site. Just being able to talk to people. When I started with camming, it was a lot of me teaching other people like about computers, and so they're not getting ripped off by people. They're saying, oh, I'm gonna sell you this great rig, and it's like a 5-year-old Dell Inspiron or something like that. So I think the divide, it kind of creates a presence where people can be taken advantage of, but it also leaves enough room that, you know, you can just aspire to get over it.
And taken advantage of in a way that I think most people don't perceive. Like, right, like the idea of like being overtaxed on this cost of your web hosting, or like sold some junk because they assume we don't know better. You know, that goes back like 150 years to New York, where prostitutes used to get charged more for saloon rooms and things like that, or more for their advertising in the paper. It's like the sin tax, but just like the internet version of it. I wanted to ask you really quick, Stoya, and I think we'll open up for questions about that kind of blurring of like bringing your whole life online. Because I feel like people, this has almost become a meme about you and your work too, where they're like, Stoya's the porn star who's a real person. And it's like, hi, we're all real people, all of us here together. Everybody in pornography is real. Hate to break it to you. I don't know. Like, could you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's like the talent pool in adult films is a body of people who are different people. So, for instance, there's one woman that I know who has not only an entirely separate persona for her stage name, but her persona has its own birthday that is different than her birthday. So some people like really divide things up, and that's their way of like processing their life or whatever. And then you have me, where once a year there's a big convention in Las Vegas called the Adult Entertainment Expo. And my first year, I was taken by the company I worked with to sign autographs at their booth and do press all day, literally like 10 hours of doing press, and then again the next day. It's really exhausting. It's like oddly work. I was not prepared for that. And about halfway through the first day, because it's an entertainment model, a lot of the work involves doing interviews and showing either your personality or a constructed persona. And then that is supposed to fuel sales of the product. So about halfway through, maybe hour 5 or 6, I thought to myself, there's no way that I can keep up some sort of persona. Like, I can't act in this role for one day straight, much less a whole week, and then, oh my God, the rest of my career. Okay, I'll just be myself. It'll be fine. They'll either hate me, and then I'll be fired, and like whatever, or it'll work, and then it'll be like easier and stuff. So my entire career has been driven by just being myself. I hardly ever lose followers on Twitter when I talk about my period now. My whole Instagram is pretty much full of my cats. We have this one cat, he only has one eye, and his name's Pixel, and he's the cutest thing in the world. And people actually, like every once in a while, someone in the comments will go, we don't want to see any more of your cats, and then everybody else jumps on them and goes, no, we love her cats, that's who she is, she's the crazy cat lady, back off, always give us cats, more cats.
Lolcats. Hashtag lolcats.
More pussy.
Pixel.
Saw that one coming.
And there's a range of ways to do it, but then on like all of that said, if you come up to me in a work environment and use my legal name, it's not pretty usually, because that says to me that there's some sort of like inability to, inability to understand boundaries, because we're in a work environment, and so the name that I use at work is Stoya. If I'm in a work environment and you come up to me and you're using the wrong name, it's like if your name is Thomas and you really hate being called Tommy, and you've got that one coworker who just has to call you Tommy, and it's like, come on, just the tiniest little bit of respect.
I mean, as far as name change, like obviously Hawk is not my real name. I mean, I like it, and I had it before this. I did, believe it or not. This name preceded that. But after having legal issues and other things, because of the advocacy I've done for the last 15 years, I have to use an AKA. I have to, because I have a professional career, which now they're kind of elided, which is a little bit weird. I'm getting used to that.
COO.
My professional career, I worked with very high-level, Fortune 100 companies, and so I couldn't have those names cross, and that's that because people can Google, and now you're all going to Google, right? No, okay. But it is a real risk to have your real name exposed to everybody in the world. I mean, not just for stalkers, which people in the sex industry do get stalkers, and so they cannot afford to have their real names out there for a lot of that. But also, again, because there are issues, there's legal precedent of people being fired for jobs later, even long into their careers, long out of the industry. So.
I'm skimming your tweets. I was listening to you and I'm skimming your tweets. While I get caught up on the tweets, let's take our first audience question. There's a microphone that you need to use for that, again, out of respect for our live streamers and everyone in the room. And I believe, who's got a question? Who wants to go first?
Phone sex voice.
Who wants to go first? That's not my phone sex voice. Over there, yes. Could we get a microphone over to you, or do you want to come up to the microphone? Come on up. Come on down. Welcome to Sex Work is Right.
Come on down.
All right. Bob Barker will get that for you.
So what sort of tech support or training do you have to give your clients so that they're not tweeting locations and exposing you to further oppression?
It's an awesome question.
I guess for me, sometimes it's first trying to protect myself and then conveying to my clients that you might want to be able to protect yourself as well. Because there'll be times where I'm doing a cam show and I realize that I have like these big loft windows in my apartment looking out at sunny Newark. Not the best view, but still you can tell very much that it's the Newark skyline. So I've just now told these people where I am, and that could, be kind of hairy. But when people like send me things, or when people come into the chat room and leave their number, I kind of say, that's not something you want to do. And I try to explain that while it feels like it's an intimate environment, you still have to treat this online. You wouldn't post your phone number on Twitter for everybody to see for obvious reasons. You shouldn't do that here either.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Are you ready, or should I go?
Except the people who do post their numbers on Twitter. Okay.
For the work that we do at Red Umbrella Project, we tell people that if they don't want to use their real name in any of the work that we're doing, that they shouldn't. And we tell them about the risk that comes with using your real name, even if you're doing something like just distributing condoms to people. There are risks. People get arrested in New York City for distributing condoms to sex workers. And the other thing that we do is we offer, our office as a point of mail contact. We do like mail-in campaigns sometimes and postcard campaigns and stuff like that. And so we don't have it go to their address, so their sort of privacy isn't compromised, and it's always just coming back to us. So I think it's really important for us to build safer spaces which people in the sex trades can access without any sort of surveillance. We have this dream, because we have a bunch of computers but no space, we have a dream of a sex worker computer lab that may one day materialize.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about Hook is that it's been online for 20 years now, almost 20 years now, and we know clients use it. We actually encourage it because, again, it sort of adds to the level of education that they get about the people who are in the industry. It lets someone feel more confident about, in the process of hiring, to treat somebody with respect, to treat somebody with safety. And it also, as part of it, we actually have a client guide that talks a little bit about, what kind of protocols are okay. And we're actually doing more and more along those lines to try and educate clients within that process, because that also helps our workers, because again, it lets them not have to do it and reduces that sort of learning curve and possible mistakes. So communication with clients to me is crucial, but clients are probably more elusive, and certainly more elusive than reaching out to people in the sex industry. As Emma had identified, it's very hard to sort of get this community to identify itself and to have a conversation. Clients more so, but obviously that's a really important part of the conversation when you talk about safety and security.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. There are two quick questions on Twitter, which I'll try to knock out quickly, and you guys can jump in if you want to, too. One was, how did Amazon know that the accounts that they were targeting and deleting were sex workers? Did you have that question, too?
I had that question, too.
You want to answer this?
Well, it's not that hard to find out, because we all have these digital fingerprints and trails. Like, just because it's online doesn't mean you can't find it. I remember when I was a college student, I was doing my journalism like final paper on sex work and online communities, and I was like, oh, I will pose as a sex worker, and people will obviously try to talk to me. I'll get to interview the clients, and 9 times out of 10, people were researching and was like, oh, no, but your ISP is Rutgers University. I've never had an escort that had their ISP Rutgers University, so what's up with this? I mean, it's very easy to find, and a lot of times they trace it through, they look at the items on your list, they look at the email address that's associated with it, and if you have like a mailing list and like eye contact, they want your address. That address isn't like right on your site, but you could still find the address that's associated with that. And also the who is information if you have your own site. If you're the webmaster of your own site and you don't hide your who is information, which I don't know why you wouldn't. But I had a acquaintance of mine that was found out that way because her site was registered to herself and her real name, and her mailing address was the same. So they matched that up and felt like, oh, well, if you're trading webcam shows for items on your wish list, you're violating the TOS, and she no longer has her Amazon account.
But how would you know, so I mean, I don't know if I need to ask this on there. How would you know that what is on your wish list is specifically geared toward being a sex worker? I get this sort of trail because, of course, you know, you can identify it through a user's path, and you can identify their IP address. I'm doing Gamble here, whatever. You can identify some sort of trail to kind of get there. But how would you identify from the list itself? Like,
like sex toys, lingerie. Sometimes it's the equipment. Like I had a list that I deleted because I was like, wow, this is evidence. Where I wanted upgrades for my graphics card. I wanted a better web camera, and there was a whole lot of lingerie, and people go, oh, who needs these things? It's probably not a housewife in Des Moines, it's a camera.
It could be a housewife in Des Moines who is also a camera.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Utah, like the highest purveyors of porn. Like, does that mean all of Utah counts as like a...
Well, it's really, if they profile us, it's kind of like with stop and frisk. If I'm walking down the street and Stoya is walking down the street, cops might stop me before they stop her because they're going to assume that I look like a criminal. And they kind of say, oh, well, what you're doing is suspicious to us because you have all these sex things on it. And sometimes people aren't bright with naming their wish lists. Like they will basically say it like porn star princess, their wish list.
That's fine.
Were you going to say?
Also, just speaking from anecdotal evidence, when you have more than one person buying things from your wish list on a single day, that's what happened. That's when killed mine.
What about your birthday? Sorry, when it's not
Anecdotal
your birthday?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, other questions from the room?
That's a good one.
Let's see some hands. One right here, I think that's close, and then we'll work our way over to you two.
Hi. So people talk about like freelance labor in general. It's hard to know when there are no standards. It's hard to know like how you should get fairly compensated. I'm wondering how like new technology has changed that. I have a second question. I'm wondering how new technology is making like working in niche markets easier or harder.
So money and niche markets. Who wants to go first?
I mean, competitive analysis. I mean, most people are, at least when you talk about online workers, I mean, they're watching everybody's hours, and you know, they're pricing accordingly in terms of their hours. I think that's pretty much where a lot of the pricing comes from for the guys I know who work in the business. As far as escorting goes, porn, I don't know. Porn depends, I think, on well, you can talk to the porn business stuff.
For the workers that work in front of the camera in porn, there are agents who do tend to somewhat standardize things to a certain extent. And then there's also just word of mouth. You do have to sort of take it with a grain of salt. Like if you ask someone what the rate for double penetration is, they might tell you it's a lot higher because maybe they don't want you doing it too because they're threatened and so they don't want the competition or whatever. But use a certain amount of common sense and you talk to other people and, you know, oh, what's your rate for this and what's your rate for this, and then you have to decide for yourself what that's worth for you. The same as with freelance writing or with freelance kitchen scrubbing or whatever.
Sorry, I was going to say, in terms of internet pricing, I will say that the higher the profile the escort can get, in other words, by supplementing with video and sort of video presence and developing that cachet, the more they can charge per hour. And that's certainly something they try and do. So if they build up a larger presence online and a larger social presence and a larger identity, they can actually sort of raise their hourly charge substantially.
It's okay. It's already old and fucked up.
We can't have nice things.
One of the really great things that I think online has helped the cam girl community, well, not cam girl, cam performer community, is we have our own forums where we hang out and talk about, you know, what we do. And about, I think it was a year ago, we just decided, you know what, we're all going to raise our rates. So it was like a mass, like, raise your rate challenge. And because there were so many of us doing it in an organized fashion, instead of the huge backlash that we expected, everybody was like, oh, I guess this is the new rate. So being able to communicate and organize and kind of look at the comparative demand, and it helps. I don't think similarly that could have happened like 50 years ago, or I don't know how easy that would have been without, you know, like a forum and Twitter, and that we could talk to each other pretty fast. And I also think because there's so many more options now, you have different revenue streams. So if you might say, oh, well, somebody of my same build and everything, like how much competition we have, but does she have a clip for sales store? So that could be my leverage. So I could price my clips at X amount, so I could then raise my cam rate. So it's a lot of math and looking at who else is out there and who's doing it. I mean, it's kind of the same thing I do when it comes to journalism and writing. I ask around, and then we all kind of get together and go, well, $50 a story is bullshit. We want more money. So.
I just wanted to do a shout out to the people who are doing troll management, sex work stigma management in the back channel. Wow. Yes.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about niche markets, particularly both the experiences I've seen in our members and my own personal experience in the trades as a trans woman. There's this weird idea, and I don't know where it started, that trans women can make a lot of money in the sex trades, which maybe they can, but I have yet to see it. And it's always the people who aren't trans women who think this. They're, you know, they say, well, you know, that's a niche market, or that's a fetish, so you must be able to make lots of money. And that's not true at all, and sort of it brings up the idea of double consciousness, W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, where these women are marketing themselves with words like tranny and she-male. Do you think that they think their services are worth a lot of money when they're marketing themselves in that sort of way? And the answer is no. And I mean, and you can even see that in the stratifications of how much people are offering for their services, what sort of language they're using, you know. So in terms of niche market, it really depends on what the niche is.
I will say, and this is sort of talking to both of them, that for men in the industry, like the rise of escort reviews has changed a lot of dynamics within the particular escorting. I'm talking specifically escorting, not porn and other areas, but in escorting industry, the introduction of forums and the introduction of client feedback and clients who will popularize and talk about their feedback is interesting. It's a big change from years ago, where the client sort of maintained a very, very strong absence from any discussions around sex industry. We have sites like Daddy's Reviews, which is probably the most popular one that is out there, and any escort who actually doesn't do a very good job and is not particularly good at what they do, it only takes a very short amount of time for them to start getting bad reviews on a site, and clients go read it. They may not participate, they may not actually engage in the forums, but very discerning clients, and we're talking about escorts who are charging $300, $400 an hour, they have discerning clients. Those clients go and read those forums and they check out them before they hire, and that actually also affects the value. I think somebody asked about the valuation.
But to bring full misandry into the conversation, sorry, they're not always telling the truth. Like, I have reviews about my theoretical sexual performance on review boards, probably to this day, that are of things that did not happen. Like, I'm like, I wasn't there, that wasn't me. I even had a customer, I don't often talk about customers, but I had a customer who, speaking of the emotional labor and the review board thing, most of our time together was him telling me about how he hangs out on message boards for clients and trolls them. And like, we were like at dinner and he was like telling me like his elaborate next plans to troll the whole board. And it made me think, like, just as like some customers don't think that sex workers on the internet could be real, I also wonder how many of the clients on those message boards are actual clients, sure, or just guys like messing around saying stuff with each other. So I think there's also a huge negative consequence for them too, where like there's it kind of feels like bullying. It can be used as bullying in ways too. So I don't think it's entirely been great, but it has certainly changed things.
Yeah,
that I wouldn't disagree with.
I'm not arguing it's better, just different.
Yeah. I'm kind of on the screw client message board sometimes too, because I'm not an escort, but I have reviews up, so that should tell you a lot. People apparently have reviewed my services. It was very interesting to read how I had sex with somebody and then made him dinner, and apparently I live in a very beautiful Manhattan loft. So my fake life is so much better because I lived in a crappy dorm at the time. So I definitely I have a hesitation because it kind of builds in that whole stigma thing where clients feel like they have power over a provider because they could write that review. So they want to push them to do something that they might not have on their menu because they now fear that they're going to have downvotes or they're going to have a bad review, and then that bad review can really make that's rent or not paying rent. So I kind of feel that that's one of the negatives of sex work in the digital age.
I want to take one more question. I'm sorry.
We could go on we could have a whole panel about reviews and probably should.
Oh my
gosh. You were up first, I think. Yeah, if you want to step up to the mic.
Context-wise.
Thank you for coming. So I recently had a discussion about sex-positive feminism, and Nigella, you were talking about how anti-trafficking discourse can really affect sex worker rights movements. So I wanted to ask a question to provide an opportunity to call out sex-positive feminism / anti-trafficking advocates and the ways in which they can obstruct and affect discourse around sex work.
Do you want to jump in first?
Sure.
Well, I think that was one of the big things that we tried to tackle with Not Your Rescue Project, is because we had a lot of these people that were saying, oh, I want to call the cops on you and destroy any future that you may have because I'm trying to rescue you and I'm trying to protect you. And what kind of makes me really upset is when you look at some quote-unquote feminists, when they start talking about sex workers, it sounds a lot like horrible patriarchs talking about all women. That idea that, oh, we have to teach them how to respect themselves. If they respected themselves, they wouldn't do this demeaning, degrading work. And I look at them like, well, I thought feminism was about the right to choose. And if I choose to have a guy jerk off to me telling a story, or if I choose to shake my ass on a pole, that's my choice. And I don't really feel like I should be, degraded or lose my voice because of it. And I also feel that we can't conflate that there's this, like there's sex trafficking and sex work. They're not the same thing, but we have to respect that there are people who chose sex work but are unfortunately now being trafficked, and there's those that are being trafficked. I feel like people think it's a zero sum, where if you support sex work, that you obviously love pimps and you love sex trafficking, which is completely not true. And I really hope that people can look into the work of sex work groups, because a lot of them do anti-trafficking work, and a lot of them do rescue work that's not under the threat of legal or jail or things like that.
Okay, so there was this survey that was released recently by the Urban Institute about the underground sex economy, which would be a great name for a band, so someone should do that. And we could have a whole other panel about why that survey was terrible, but it was really great in one thing, which is one of its conclusions was, there is no network of traffickers in the United States. There isn't. There's not some conspiracy of traffickers moving thousands upon thousands of women to wherever the Super Bowl is being held on some given year. But what these anti-trafficking groups take advantage of is a sort of viral clickbait nature of the internet. And they will use anything. They seem to have no shame whatsoever. There was this awful satire website they created, which some of my co-panelists might remember, where it was supposed to be a joke against sex worker rights movements. And it was just, it was this terrible, like, they were poking fun at trafficking, which was awful to look at. They will use the same hashtags that sex worker rights movements use to try to jump in and flood conversations. They will, our social media across the board has been flagged multiple times as inappropriate, or they'll use other things that aren't even remotely true. So yeah, basically they know that they can't win by making arguments, so they'll try anything and everything else.
We're gonna close. I'm so sorry to cut you off. Do you want to say something like 30 seconds? Can you do it?
I will
30 seconds.
30 seconds basically is that all of us who are activists within the sex industry, we know that trafficking exists. It's a real problem. It affects a lot of very real people. Those aren't the same people that choose to work in the industry as a mature adult. And that's the big separation that all of us really work hard to make, because the implications of that come from that whole movement comes from a lineage that has been anti-porn, anti-women's rights in many contexts for many, many years. And I think it's just a new face on a very, very old hate and a very, very old anger. And I think that, I think we all know that, and I'm sharing it.
See, now you make me want to do a panel on #MyNYPD and the anti-trafficking movement and how they use the internet, because we're old hands at this, but they're just figuring it out. And I think that, we could perhaps teach them a few things. I am so sorry I didn't get to every question in the room and every question on the internet, but there's gonna be a brief segue between this panel and the next one, and in that time we will be across the hall in room D. I'll have books and I'll be signing, and you can talk to Emma about Red Umbrella Project and how to get hooked into that. You can ask everyone questions about their work. Thank you so much for being part of this huge conversation.